Well, last Wednesday night, we began looking at Zechariah chapter 5, and we saw the first of a two-part vision that is set forth in this chapter. And that first vision was of a flying scroll. Zechariah looks up and he sees a scroll flying through the air. And written on that scroll, on one side, it says, "Every thief shall be expelled." On the other side, it says that every perjurer shall be expelled. Well, what this is alluding to, and we're going to see this even more so as we get into the second part of this vision in our lesson tonight, it's talking about some of the sins that were continuing to take place. While the people had come a long way in coming back to faithfulness and trying to get back to following God's will, there were still people that were committing sin. There were still people who had not come as far as they needed to go. And so this is talking about God's judgment is going to come upon those who continue to engage in those types of sins. And so this stands as a warning. We talked about the fact that it says that this warning was going to enter into their homes and would stay there. It would be before them at all times, a constant reminder that if they were engaging in these types of actions, which as we acknowledged, stood in direct contrast to two of the Ten Commandments. We talked about thou shalt not steal, and thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. And these are things that people who were supposedly following God were continuing to engage in. And so we see the importance of this being brought to their attention, because ultimately God was wanting to bless this nation. But He could not bless them if they continued to live in this type of sinful behavior. Well, as we come into the second part of this vision, we're going to see what God's plan is in regard to that wickedness. And He portrays this from the standpoint of a woman in a basket. So let's look at verses 5 through 11. Then the angel who talked with me came out and said to me, "Lift your eyes now, and see what this is that goeth forth." So I asked, "What is it?" And he said, "It is a basket that is going forth." He also said, "This is their resemblance throughout the earth. Here is a lead disc lifted up, and this is a woman sitting inside the basket." Then he said, "This is wickedness." And he thrust her down into the basket and threw the lead cover over its mouth. Then I raised my eyes and looked, and there were two women coming with the wind in their wings, for they had wings like the wings of a stork. And they lifted up the basket between earth and heaven. So I said to the angel who talked with me, "Where are they carrying the basket?" And he said to me, "To build a house for it in the land of Shinar. When it is ready, the basket will be set there on its base." So while the angel is speaking to Zechariah, he tells him to look up. And whenever he looks up, he sees this image, but initially he doesn't recognize what it is. And he asks the angel, what is it that I'm seeing? And depending upon which translation of the Bible you're reading, the angel tells him that he's seeing either a basket or a barrel. Some translations use those different designations. And then he said that he saw a large lead disc. Well, this was talking about the lid for that container. We probably all have seen, metal drums and the round lids that fit over the top of those metal drums. And that's kind of the image that I have in mind when I picture what this is trying to portray. But it says that he sees this lid get lifted off, and he's shown inside this barrel or inside this basket, and said that there was a woman inside the basket. And the angel said to him, "This is wickedness." And what he's saying, this is the personification of wickedness. He said, when you see this part of the image, I want you to identify not with the identity of who this woman is, but the fact that she is representative of the wickedness that's going on in this nation. It said that after that was said, the wording that's used pictures this as if the angel slams the lid back down so that this woman is not able to get out of this basket. What this is showing us is God's desire for that nation. He wants them to get rid of wickedness, to completely remove it from their sight, to get it as far from them as possible. And so he's portraying wickedness from the standpoint of being placed within this basket or in this barrel and being sealed in a way that it cannot come out. God's desire is that Israel, that they will completely remove this sinfulness from their land. And that's what's seen in the next part of this vision. Notice it says that he sees two women. And these two women, they come and they're flying with the wind. And it says they had wings like the wings of a stork. Now, something that I find interesting about the description of wings like a stork. If we go back into the Old Testament and we look at the law of Moses when it's talking about clean and unclean animals, a stork is specifically listed as a bird that is unclean. And so most of the sources that I looked at say that what this is indicating is that God had the ability to use even unclean or unrighteous sources to produce his results. You know, we think about other instances in the Old Testament where he did that. You know, he used Nebuchadnezzar, did he not, to punish this nation. He allowed him to rise to power. We read of other instances where God used different worldly leaders to bring about his will. But the most interesting part of this vision to me, and we really have to go back into the Old Testament even further, is the mention of the land of Shinar. The land of Shinar is mentioned numerous times in the Old Testament. It's mentioned for the first time in Genesis chapter 10 and verse 10. So this was a land that had been settled very, very early in the history of man. It was the very first location that was settled by a kingdom that was established by a man by the name of Nimrod. This land, over time, came to take on a new name. Anyone want to venture a guess what it came to be known as eventually? Babylon. Babylon. But what we find as we study throughout Old Testament history and then even coming into New Testament times, that land, the land of Shinar and eventually the land of Babylon, which eventually was overtaken by the Medo-Persian kingdom, that was always seen as a place where wickedness reigned supreme. Back in the Old Testament, this was a land where sinful people, those who didn't want to follow God's will, this was the place where they would go. The land of Shinar was also the place in Genesis 11 and verse 2 where another very interesting occurrence took place. How many of us remember the story of the Tower of Babel? That took place in Shinar. And what was it that led the people to believing they could and should build this tower? It was sinful pride. So this was a land that has always been identified with sin. And so what this vision is trying to get across to the people is you need to leave that sinfulness where you came from. When you leave Babylon and you come back home, you need to leave that sinfulness there. When it talks about that it's going to be put in this basket and carried and established in the land of Shinar, that's what it's saying. God's saying, I don't want any of this going on in this land. I want you to get it away from you, and I want it left where you came from. That's why you were taken to Babylon in the first place. You were taken there because of your sin. You were to be there until you repented. If you truly repented, you should have left the sin there. But yet here you are, continuing to engage in some of those things that you should have left behind. But as I mentioned, even coming into the New Testament, after Babylon had fallen, and even after the Medes and Persian Empire had fallen to the Greeks and then to the Romans, we find this description of Babylon still being used to refer to a place of wickedness and rebellion against God. How many times do we see it used in the book of Revelation? Now, oftentimes in Revelation, it's used as a symbol of Rome and the wickedness, the evil, and the decadence that was going on there. But the reason that Babylon was used was because in the minds of the Jews and in the minds of those Christians who had a knowledge of the Old Testament Scriptures, Shinar and Babylon was always identified with evil. And so that's why we continue to see this being used. And so in this vision, what God is trying to get His people to see are two things. Number one, He's going to hold them accountable. Yes, He's allowed them to leave captivity and come back home, but He's still going to hold them accountable. They still have to do what's right. But second, He's showing them that even though they were enjoying the privilege of being in a relationship with God, they still had a responsibility on their end. Well, the same goes for us today as children of God. We have a great honor and privilege of being in a relationship with God, but it's not a one-way street. We have to do our part, and if we do our part, God will do His part. There's still responsibilities that we have to live by, just as the Jews had to live by. Any questions or comments on chapter 5? All right, let's move on now into chapter 6. Chapter 6, we're going to see another two-part vision. What we're going to find here is the last of these prophetic visions that Zechariah receives. And something to keep in mind, these visions were not ones that he received over a period of years. He received all 8 of these visions in the span of one night. One night. But at the close of this chapter, after all of these visions have been set forth, we're going to find a very, very powerful prophecy. A prophecy concerning the coming Messiah. And He's going to be depicted as one taking upon 2 roles. And these 2 roles that He's depicted as taking on were roles that commonly were held by 2 different people. But the Messiah is going to be pictured as someone who holds both roles. Folks, that was going to serve as an indicator to the people living during the time that the Messiah would come, that this man is someone special. That he is different from everybody else. Because he was going to serve in a twofold role that was generally held by one. But we'll get to that as we get to the end of the chapter. We're going to start out with a vision of 4 chariots. And we see this in the first 3 verses. It says, "Then I turned and raised my eyes and looked, and behold, 4 chariots were coming from between 2 mountains, and the mountains were made of bronze. With the first chariot were red horses, with the second chariot black horses, and with the third chariot white horses, and with the fourth chariot dappled horses, strong steeds." So in this vision, Zechariah sees 4 chariots, and with these chariots there are 4 different groupings of horses that each have different colors. Well, you may remember that back in an earlier vision that Zechariah has, he's already seen an image of 4 horns indicating power and authority. He's already seen an image of 4 craftsmen. This number 4, we often talk about how the number 7 is indicative of divine perfection, divine completion. The number 4 oftentimes is indicative of earthly totality or earthly completion. So with that in mind, these chariots, with the number 4 being used, it's indicating the fact that enemies are surrounding them on all sides. They're being completely surrounded, totally surrounded by enemies on every side. War is going to be coming at them from every direction. But with the image of these mountains, with the meaning of the colors of the horses, as we'll indicate here in just a moment, what this is all pointing to is war. A difficult time that may lay ahead. You know, oftentimes chariots were seen as symbols of war. But what this is going to show us is God's judgment against the enemies of the Jews. Remember, in an earlier vision, God has already promised His protection. That He would be there with them so long as they were faithful. Going back to that last vision, so long as they removed their sin, so long as they put it in the basket and send it back to Babylon symbolically, God's going to be there. He's going to be those strong bronze mountains there, providing them that strength and the protection that they need in order to grow and to thrive. We look at the colors that it mentions. Now, this is something we've talked about numerous times, so it shouldn't be anything new. The color red, often indicative of bloodshed or the loss of life. Black, often a symbol of destruction and sorrow and pain. White, in the context of war, is an indication of victory. But then we see a color used that's more rare. One that we don't find mentioned very often in the Bible, and that is dappled color. Other translations will say speckled or ashen. And typically what this is used to refer to is disease, pestilence, and destruction. Those things that are typically the after results of war. After war has gone through and has decimated everything, what remains oftentimes is destruction and sickness and pain. Once again, what do all of these things point to? It points to war. It points to battle. But what this is showing us in this vision is the fact that if the Jews remain faithful to God, they're not going to have to go to war because God is going to go to war on their behalf. God is going to protect them. He is going to build that wall of fire around them, as we talked about in an earlier lesson. He's going to provide them with protection from those enemies that are going to come from every side. But then notice the next section, verses 4 through 8. Then I answered and said to the angel who talked with me, "What are these, my Lord?" And the angel answered and said to me, "These are 4 spirits of heaven, who go out from their station before the Lord of all the earth. The one with the black horses is going to the north country. The white are going after them, and the dappled are going toward the south country. Then the strong steeds went out, eager to go, that they might walk to and fro throughout the earth. And he said, Go, walk to and fro throughout the earth. So they walked to and fro throughout the earth. And he called to me and spoke to me, saying, See, those who go toward the north country have given rest to my spirit in the north country." So Zechariah asks for an explanation. What is it that I'm seeing? And the angel tells him that what he is seeing are 4 spirits of heaven. Well, you may remember back in Zechariah chapter 4, verses 5 through 7, it talks about the fact that through the power of the Holy Spirit, that their work on the temple would be complete, that nation would be restored. So going back to looking at that concept of the number 4 indicating an earthly completion, more than likely what this is talking about is God sending them what they needed in order to be successful. And we're going to find that what that means is those enemies are going to be driven back. They're not going to have to be worried day in and day out. Are we going to have to go into battle? No, they're going to be able just to focus upon the task that's at hand. Because notice as the vision says, it says the black horses, they're going to go to the north. Well, oftentimes when we see that referred to, it's talking about what was at this point the Medo-Persian Empire. This was essentially to the north and to the east of where Jerusalem was. And so when it talks about the north country, usually that's talking about this land that had been Babylon that was now Medo-Persia. And it's talking about how God is going to drive them back. God is going to establish peace in that place. Meaning they're no longer going to be coming trying to oppress the Jews as they work. This black horse indicating if God has to fight, if God has to bring about death, that's what he's going to do. But notice who it says is coming right behind the black, the white. White, indicative of victory and peace. God is going to bring about a peaceful relationship. But then it talks about also to the south. Well, what major world kingdom would have been to the south of Judea? Think about your geography. What would have been to the south? Egypt. Well, we've already talked about the fact that Egypt had risen up and had tried to oppress some. There had been some that had fled to Egypt and then ended up going back because they were warned about oppression that would take place. So it's saying that although you've been worried that the Persians would come from the north, that the Egyptians would come from the south, even though you've been worried about that, God, he's going to drive them back. God is going to fight on your behalf so that you will be able to live in peace and complete God's work in Jerusalem. But it all goes back to them doing what we saw in the last vision. God wasn't going to fight for them if they weren't going to live for him. They had to do his will. But then we see the second part of this vision. We see a promise. Some people refer to this as the second part of the vision, as I just did. I kind of struggle with exactly how to describe this. Because on one hand, Zechariah is seeing this, but on another hand, it's different from what he's already been seeing, or what he's already been shown. Because ultimately, this is a message. It's not something that he's seeing. He's not looking into the sky and seeing this. This is something that he's being told, that's being revealed to him. And it's the promise of a branch. We see this in verses 9 through 13. Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, receive the gift from the captives from Heldiah, Tobijah, and Jediah, who have come from Babylon, and go the same day and enter the house of Josiah, the son of Zephaniah. Take the silver and gold, make an elaborate crown, and set it on the head of Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Then speak to him, saying, thus says the Lord of hosts, saying, behold the man, whose name is the branch. From his place he shall branch out, and he shall build the temple of the Lord. Yes, he shall build the temple of the Lord. He shall bear the glory, and shall sit and rule on his throne. So he shall be a priest on his throne, and the counsel of peace shall be between them both. So you notice, this prophecy is not being delivered by way of visions. It's being delivered simply by way of inspiration, by way that most of the other prophets received their prophecy. It's described as being the word of the Lord. He's not seeing a vision and then being given an interpretation of that vision. He's simply being told a message from God. Zechariah is told, he said, there's some people that have recently come back from Babylon, and they've come bringing gifts. says, you accept those gifts. You take that silver and gold that they bring, and you go to the home of the high priest, and there you make a crown out of that silver and gold, and you take it in and you set it on the head of Joshua, the high priest. He said, and once you set that crown upon his head, you say to the high priest, thus says the Lord of hosts, behold, the man whose name is the branch. This is not saying that the high priest himself is who is being referred to in this vision. But the high priest is being seen as the main spiritual leader at that time. What's being done is he, in this part of this explanation, in this action that Zechariah is being told to do, the high priest is being used to personify the coming Messiah. He was this current spiritual leader. When the Messiah came, it would no longer be these high priests from the tribe of Levi. Because when the Messiah came, he would become the great high priest. Well, let's talk about this name, branch. The branch. Well, this figure is used multiple times in the prophets referring to the Messiah. And it's talking about his royal lineage from David, that he would be a descendant of David. Now, this was something that was key to the Jews. They took great stock in their genealogy. Those that you descended from typically held much more meaning in that society than they do today. Simply based upon who you descended from, you were in different levels of society, or you were assigned to different trades, or different areas to live, things of that nature. Your lineage was very, very important. And so the Jews, to know that the Messiah was someone that was going to come from the lineage of David, would be a branch from David. This was something that was significant, because many of the Jews would look back and would consider David their greatest king. He was going to be a descendant from that line. But notice that it also tells us that this branch, that he was going to essentially branch out. He was going to leave the place where he is. Well, at this time, where was the Messiah? He was in heaven. He was still in heaven with God at this point. But he was going to branch out. As John 1:14 tells us, the Word was going to become flesh and come to dwell among us. He was going to branch out from heaven, and he was going to come to earth, but he was going to come with a purpose. He was coming to build a temple. What was going on at the time that all of this was happening? There was a temple being built. And the temple that was being built at this time was seen as being of lesser elegance, was seen as inferior to the one that had stood before. There were many of the Jews that they were disappointed and discouraged because of that fact. And so Zechariah is telling them, well, this branch is going to come and he's going to build a temple. And the temple that he's going to build is going to be far grander even than the one that stood before. Because the temple that the branch is coming to build will be one that will stand forever. This branch was also going to be the total embodiment of glory. Because what we're going to see as we look at the rest of this chapter, this branch is going to serve both as king and priest. Now I want you to stop and think with me for just a moment. How many people do we read about in the Bible prior to Jesus How many people do we read about in the Bible that served as both a king and a priest?
One.
Who? Melchizedek. The only one. And Melchizedek lived during the time before the law of Moses. Now this has led some people to develop kind of some erroneous views as to exactly who Melchizedek was. Some have come to believe that Melchizedek was, to use a big term, a pre-incarnate form of Christ, that basically Jesus came and appeared in the form of Melchizedek simply to provide a prophetic looking forth. I don't think there's enough evidence in the Scriptures for us to take that stance. But all we know about him is we're told that he was a priest of God and he was the king of Salem. Well, Salem was the original name of what? Put Jeru in front of it. Jerusalem. Where was the temple located? In Jerusalem. Where was Christ's kingdom going to come into establishment? In Jerusalem. Where was the gospel going to be proclaimed for the first time? In Jerusalem. So we see these connections there. We see these indicators. And they all serve the purpose of trying to help the Jews recognize Jesus. They're given all of these indicators, all of these prophecies. This is who you need to be looking for. You need to be looking for someone who's going to come along who serves as both king and priest. But by the time that Jesus came on the scene, the Jews had come to believe that the Messiah was going to be simply an earthly king. They had removed the spiritual aspect because they thought the Messiah, he's coming to set us free from the oppression of Rome. He's going to be another Moses. He's going to come and deliver us. But all of this is there to point us to the fact that Jesus is this branch of David, that Jesus is this promised Messiah, and that through what the Jews were seeking to accomplish in Jerusalem at that time, the Messiah was going to come as a result of those efforts. All right, we'll stop there. We didn't look at verses 14 and 15, but they just simply elaborate a little bit on what we've been talking about here with the temple. So we'll just plan on starting in Zechariah chapter 7 next Wednesday night. And of course, if anybody has any questions on chapter 6, we'll look at those before we start that next chapter.